I'm Randy Hawthorne, your Executive Director here today, and with me I have Nevin, and
Hello.
we are going to be doing some simple strategic planning today, which everyone could always use some help with, I am sure, as Nevin would probably agree. So with that, how are you today?
I am doing great. Thank you, Randy. It's great to be here. I appreciate the opportunity.
Awesome. I do want to remind people as you are logging in that yes, we will be recording this so that you can share it with others, or if you need to leave a little early or whatever the case may be, we will be recording this. Just wanted you to know that we will be recording this, and you will be getting a link to a recording that we will be recording. With that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Nevin, and let's get started. We have a lot of interactivity today, so be on your toes, everyone.
Thanks, Randy. Okay, well, great. It's really great to be here, guys. I'm so excited to share with you simple strategic planning, a method that I've been working on with my clients. And so what I sort of want to do today is just give you a little bit of background about myself before I kind of give you a preview of the session. I have been a consultant, I think, since I was a child. I have two entrepreneurial parents who used to talk about their businesses around the dinner table, and sometimes not the best conversations, but I always wanted to help. And so I decided at a very young age that, you know what, I want to be a consultant. Found the writings of Peter Drucker to be really instrumental in my personal growth. Went to the University of Texas at Austin business honors program. I think there might be some business honors and UT Austin alumni here on the call today. So hello to all of you if you were on the call. Afterwards, went to law school and went to a law school specifically so I could be recruited into a consulting firm. It's kind of a circuitous way of doing it, but that's what I did. Started working for McKinsey Company, a large consulting firm, worked with large Fortune 500 companies, and have since kind of worked as an independent freelancer through a number of projects with large companies, smaller companies, startups. And in the last 6 months, I've been really focusing my practice on nonprofits. So kind of a long way of saying, I've always wanted to be a consultant. I am a consultant, and I'm here to help. So anyway, that's my background, and you can read a little bit about my background on the slide, but that's the background that I'm bringing to today's webinar. So what are the learning objectives for today's discussion? Well, you can think of it in three different areas, right? What I'd like for everyone on this webinar to be able to do by the end of the webinar is explain the need for a simple strategic planning model, describe the overview of the simple strategic planning cycle, and describe individual aspects of each step in the simple strategic planning cycle. So what the need is, what the overview is, and what are some aspects of each step in the cycle, I think will be beneficial to everyone on this call. And just in terms of logistics, you can type your questions in the question box on the right-hand side of or wherever on the screen you have your questions. Randy will be monitoring the questions and sharing those with me at the end of the webinar, but there'll be portions of this webinar where I'll be taking questions just to kind of let you collect your thoughts and download them to us. As Randy mentioned, the recording is going to be shared after the webinar, so no worries about that. This is what the question slide will look like whenever we get to the questions. So that's kind of just an FYI. And we'll start with kind of initial poll just to kind of get to know folks who are on the call today. The question that I'd like to ask everyone here is, what is your role in your organization? Are you a board member? Are you an executive director, CEO, VP or director, a manager, individual contributor, or a consultant? And it looks like the poll has been placed up by Randy. So go ahead and enter your thoughts there. Hopefully we covered most of the options. If it's another option that's not on there, then that's our fault. So we'll take a few seconds to kind of get your thoughts and get your opinions there. It looks like the polls are coming in. In progress, it looks like we've got around 32% executive director CEOs. We've got VP directors and managers, individual contributors are around 18% each. Board members 16% and consultants 50%. So a pretty diverse group of people today, with some good representation from the executive CEO suite. So that's great. Welcome all. What are we going to do today? So our agenda is the following, right? We're going to talk about why do we need simple strategic planning. We're going to do the overview of the simple strategic planning method. We will go in depth on the same. We'll talk about some next steps, and then we'll do a little bit of a Q&A. So that's kind of the overview that we'll be doing. So why don't we kind of just get started? So why do we need simple strategic planning? You might be wondering the same thing. There's a number of reasons why. 95% of a typical workforce, doesn't understand its organization's strategy, and it's just a mind-boggling statistic, but it's one that has come up several times in my research. And if you can just imagine, like 95% of a sports team not understanding its coach's strategy, it kind of gives you a sense of how serious of a problem that is, because strategy can be difficult to understand. It can be difficult to communicate. And that's another reason why I've kind of developed this simple strategic planning method. Over 70% of corporate strategic initiatives are never successfully implemented. So that tells you another piece of why we need a simple strategic planning process. And finally, there are just a plethora of strategic planning frameworks and approaches on the market that can be confusing, that can be contradictory. And so one of the things that I'd like to do with this process is make it easy for people to really understand how to kind of make strategic planning work for their organization. So let's talk a little bit about the overview of this process. It's very straightforward and simple if you think about it in terms of a cycle. So what we've got, if you start at the very top, is just like a general kickoff, followed by what's called a situational analysis, and I'll go into depth on each of these, followed by what I like to call a purpose section of strategic planning, where you kind of focus on your organization's purpose. Then an examination into the advanced tools that are at your disposal, and kind of a decision-making process as to whether or not you need some of those advanced tools. A examination into the issues or goals of your organization, development of a document, and finally, doing regular strategy reviews for your strategy. So what does a kickoff look like, right? The kickoff portion asks, you ask yourself, are you ready to do strategic planning? Because not all organizations are ready. Have you gathered all your documentation in one place? Have you designed the strategic planning process? Those are kind of the steps of the kickoff. Then you've got, again, the situational analysis, in which you're going to conduct an internal analysis. You'll likely be considering conducting an external analysis, and you'll be hopefully developing a SWOT, which is a very useful tool both to kind of assess your organization and to develop additional strategies. And we'll kind of go into further depth on each of these shortly. Next, when you kind of get into the purpose section, that's where you're going to be focusing on your mission, your vision, and your values. I just had a workshop on that with a client last night. That can be an energizing and fruitful place to spend your time, getting everyone in alignment around a crisp set of messages that they can kind of repeat to the outside world and communicate very easily. So we'll be talking a little bit more about the mission, vision, and values in today's discussion. There are a number of advanced tools that are available to strategic planners, which include all of the following, right? Like they include developing a theory of change and examining your program portfolio, evaluating your business model, looking at your organizational capacity and your leadership capacity, and even building a strategy map. I recently finished a project where I helped a client build a strategy map, which they then use to talk to donors, to talk to new employees, to talk to existing employees about their strategy. It can be a very powerful tool, but I've kind of grouped a lot of these tools under advanced tools because they're not necessary for every strategic planning process, particularly if you're a smaller nonprofit. You may not necessarily need these, but as you get bigger and more complex and more nuanced, you might want to consider these because these can be very powerful tools. Next, you're going to be deciding on an issues-based approach or a goals-based approach, and then developing the objectives and tasks associated with each. You're going to draft and socialize your strategic plan document with your different stakeholders and constituencies. And then, like I said before, review your strategy on a quarterly, biannual, or annual basis. So this is kind of the overview of the model that I wanted to share with you today. What we've done is done one circle around with just the top level kind of descriptions, and now we've done a second circle with a little bit more description. Now we're going to do a third circle with more in-depth discussion around each of these. But before we do so, I'd love to know, where are you in your strategic planning cycle? And the options that we have on the screen, I think we've got a little bit more of a limited set of options in the poll. But I'm going to ask Randy to put up poll number 2 so that we can get a sense as to kind of where you are in the cycle. And the options are, you don't know, you're in the kickoff stage, the situational analysis / purpose, issues and goals, or strategy review. So we've got a number of options there, and looking to kind of see where you are in the process. It looks like, there's just in the early results, it appears that there's a pretty good balance amongst options. I can see the results now and see as they're coming in. And it looks like around 25% are kind of focused on their issues and goals, which is fantastic. But 22% are just kind of kicking off. 21% don't know. And then we've got some people who are like looking at the situational analysis and the strategy review as well. So I like that. It's a good bell curve of people in different kind of sections of the strategic planning process, which makes sense depending on where you are for your organization. So that's great. Thanks for answering the poll. Let's move on to the next slide, where I'll just kind of take some questions and listen to your questions. So if you want to take a moment to put in any questions for myself or for Randy, go ahead and do that in the question box.
Yes, we will be sending the recording to you via email.
Perfect.
Here they come. How do you decide between issues and goals approaches?
Right. It's a good question, and we'll get to that question later in the podcast. So I will definitely touch on that. And Randy, what I was thinking is, if you want to take the questions and just kind of just let me know what they are during the Q&A portion, or we can do them now.
Absolutely.
Whatever.
Yep.
Okay. Perfect. So great question. And we've got a slide that addresses on that specifically. So let's kind of go into kind of in-depth what simple strategic planning looks like, right? So why don't we talk about the kickoff? Now we've looked at this slide already. The next slide is, how do you know if you're ready, right? And some of the questions you want to ask yourself is, have you developed a picture of success? What will success look like when you're done? Have you outlined the strategic and operational issues that you're facing? Strategic being, the longer term issues that will affect your organization in the 3 to 5 year time frame. The operational issues being the ones that are more of like a 1 year time frame kind of issue. Have you checked on the conditions for success? So do you know what conditions you'll need to put in place to have a successful outcome? And finally, have you planned your data collection process? So all things to think about, just to ask yourself, okay, how do you know if you're ready? Another very good thing to do in the kickoff process is to gather all of your documentation in one place. So this relates to your mission related documents, your financial documents, your organizational capacity, and your leadership documents. And one project that I've worked on recently, we just set up a Google Drive where we organized all of these documents into a shared drive that was accessible by everyone on the strategic planning task force. It worked really well, and I'd highly recommend using a similar process so that everyone can kind of access the right documents when they need them, and remind people that they exist there, and kind of train people on how to use that. Next, you want to design the planning process, and here's a sample work plan of something that I worked on with a client. You can see that we've got all of those steps on the left-hand side, the kickoff, the mission, the purpose section. We went into perspectives, themes, and objectives and measures. These are things that relate to a balanced scorecard, measures and targets and initiatives, and I'll talk about that shortly as well. And then a final readout of the strategic plan. And you can see that it kind of lasted almost 4 months, which is the general length of a strategic planning process. Anywhere between 3 to 5 months is pretty standard. So you're going to want to ask yourself, who will lead the process? Who's going to be on the strategic planning committee? Will you hold a retreat or multiple retreats? Will you use a consultant? Who's going to write the plan? How will you keep the board and staff informed? So all potential questions that you're going to be asking yourself, and good opportunities to think about what your strategic planning process is going to look like. So here's another poll, and I promise we only have 6 polls, so we're almost halfway there through the polls. But I want to ask you, where are you in the kickoff stage? Are you ready, almost ready, not ready, or thinking about it? So we've got
quick to the butt.
yeah, you guys are quick. I like it. We've got almost 55% voted, and we've got about looks like almost a third of you are ready, and a third are almost ready. Around 20% or so are not ready yet, and around 23% are still thinking about it. So that's great. We have a lot of different perspectives here, and a lot of people who are just ready. So ready to go. Let's move on to the next slide. So that was the kickoff. Now in the situational analysis, we're going to kind of go into further depth as to what it looks like to conduct an internal analysis, an external analysis, and a SWOT, and why to do a SWOT. So when you think about an internal analysis, you have a lot of different options to self-assess, and some of this depends on whether or not you're a large organization or a small organization. And so what I recommend at first, the small organizations, is a board assessment tool that's been created by the Nonprofit Association of Oregon. It's free, it's self-administered, and there's a link to it in the slides, which I'll send you by email after this recording, if you've registered for today's webinar. Same with medium organizations. There's another board self-assessment questionnaire that's made by the New Hampshire Center for Nonprofits. It does cost a little bit of money. I have the link in the slides too, just something to think about. And then for larger organizations, there's something called the CCAT, or the Core Capacity Assessment Tool by TCC Group. It's $350, and it's a more in-depth analysis as to your capacity. So these are some different options depending on the size of organization that you are, as to kind of what you might be able to use for a self-assessment. And another thing you want to ask yourself is, how are you going to learn from internal stakeholders, right? One way to do it, a very light way to do it, is modeled after another nonprofit's methodology. They're called Listen for Good, and they're a nonprofit devoted basically to listening to stakeholders of other nonprofits. And they've developed a very simple methodology involving, like just 2 to 3 questions, short answers. Just a sample question would be something like, how likely is it that you would recommend our nonprofit to a friend or family member? Generally, you'll see a high response rate, and there's less time required for respondents to actually respond. So that's kind of a light approach you can take with stakeholders if you want to kind of just get like a directional sense as to where things are. You can also take a more in-depth approach, where you ask, somewhere along the lines of like 8 to 10 questions, get longer answers. Ask questions like, what is your vision for our organization within the next 5 to 10 years? And you might see a low to medium response rate just because it requires a little bit more time for respondents and interviewees to respond. And you'll also need to follow up with respondents as to kind of what were the results of the survey that you did. But these are just a couple of different options, on the spectrum of things you can use to learn from your internal stakeholders. Now, when you want to think about external analysis, right, how to assess the trends and forces in a VUCA world. And VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, as I'm sure a lot of people on this call can probably appreciate in today's, COVID and other kind of with other trends that are happening around the world as well. But how do you assess those trends? So we've got a few tools on the left-hand side of the slide. Some of them are basic, some of them are advanced. The basic ones are shaded in green. The more advanced ones have like a green outline around them with dotted lines. So we've got, field of service trends. So what are the major trends and developments in your field of service? Client analysis. So are you providing what you want, or sorry, what they want and what they need? Another basic tool is a competitor analysis. And here you're asking, how do your programs kind of compare? I'm working on that with another client as well. Collaborator analysis, what are potential areas of collaboration? What are the pros and cons of doing so? And a PESTEL analysis, and that stands for political, economic, societal, technological, environmental, and legal trends. And you're kind of asking yourself, what are those trends and how are they impacting our organization? So those are the basic tools to understand your external environment. Some more advanced tools might be, looking at organizational capacity. So just what are the general trends in human resources and technology, structures and systems, just generally speaking. What are the leadership trends around leadership development and board governance? Regarding your business model, what are the general trends in terms of funding, and what are some innovative business models that you can learn from? And then scenario planning. Here you're going to ask yourself, across all of these different trends, which are the most important ones and what scenarios can they create? I've seen an uptick in interest of scenario planning for clients, particularly because there are some uncertain scenarios that are taking place for the fall, whether or not people are going to be online or offline. So just something to think about when you're doing strategic planning and external analysis. Now, what this is all going to lead to is what's called a SWOT analysis, and that should be essentially like an analysis of your strengths, your weaknesses, your opportunities, and your threats or challenges. Sometimes it's challenges in like a nonprofit context. Sometimes it's threats in a for-profit context, but it's generally called a SWOT or a SWOC. And these can also lead to very, very interesting strategies that can emerge when you do what's called a TOES strategy matrix. And that's what's on the right-hand side of this slide, where you take your strengths, your weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and you put them on different axes of a 2x2 square, and you essentially develop strategies by combining your strengths and opportunities, your weaknesses and your opportunities, your weaknesses and your threats, and your strengths and your threats. And it kind of gives you a sense of where you should invest your time, what programs you need to decide on, what programs you might need to divest because they're a match of your weaknesses and challenges, and which ones you need to defend where you have strengths that can meet some of the challenges that you face. So just kind of an interesting strategic tool that I definitely recommend doing as the kind of culmination of your situational analysis. So just some questions to kind of reflect on right now in the presentation. Ask yourself, which of the approaches will you look to use for internal analysis? light or in depth, and why. And feel free to just write them in the chat box if you'd like, just, your thoughts. Which of the external analysis tools would you use on the basic side, the field of service trends, client analysis, competitor analysis, collaborator analysis, PESTEL trends, or on the advanced side, the organizational capacity, leadership capacity, the business model, the scenario planning. And finally, what has been your experience with SWOT analyses, and do you have any experience with TOES analyses? Do you, want to engage in that type of analysis in your situational analysis? Just questions for reflection. So that kind of concludes the portion on situational analysis. What we'll do now is look at purpose, but want to invite you to kind of reflect on what we've just talked about so far, and put some questions in the question box. And all of these questions I'll get to at the end of the presentation when we do a Q&A. But if you have any questions so far on situational analysis at the kickoff, feel free to write them in now. So again, on the purpose side of things, what we've got is the vision, the mission, and the values. So I'm going to ask folks here on the call, how long is your mission statement? And I'm going to ask Randy if he could put up poll number 4. Is it 8 words or less? Is it 8 to 20 words, more than 20 words, or are you not sure? Just kind of curious as to where mission statements fall. And it looks like, and I can see some of the responses coming in. I mean, it looks like 50% of people have voted, and almost 80%, almost 90% are between 8 to 20 words or more than 20 words, which is very interesting. Only 6% are 8 words or less, and 3% are not sure. It's fine. Looks like almost 63% have voted now. So I think you'll be able to see the results. Yeah, there you go. So you can see there, a vast majority are between 8 to 20 and more than 20 words, which is very interesting. So we'll talk about, the ideal length of a mission statement shortly. But what you want to do what you want to think about when you refine your mission statement, right, is all of the different opportunities that people in your organization have to think about the work that they're doing and to communicate to other people the work that they're doing. So just 2 examples of where this can take place is like where a staff member or yourself, you give an elevator pitch about your organization, maybe at a community meeting or at a professionals association, and you've got like 30 seconds to just tell people what you do. You want that to be as crisp as possible so that they understand what you do and that people can reach you if they have, business that connects to yours. And then, just in terms of business development, if you've got a person in your organization who's working on developing business and they're trying to think about, well, who do I need to talk to help develop my organization? Having the mission statement can be a good way to filter out different kinds of conversations and be a criteria that people use to make their jobs to make them more effective at their jobs. So having a clear mission will help your team, make better decisions and communicate more effectively. And I asked about the length of the mission because there's really a lot of guidance around a mission statement being around 8 words or less. And it's interesting to me that so few of the people on this call have a mission statement that is that length, that sort of best practice length. So just to kind of keep in mind, 8 words or less is like the standard that our good friend Peter Drucker used to say. I think he used to say a mission should fit on a t-shirt. And there's been some research around, the ideal length of it. But basically, it doesn't have to be that length, but you just want to keep that in mind as like, if it's not that length, you want to ask yourself, well, is it worth it to have it longer? And there's a few different approaches to developing your mission statement, right? There's an ends approach and there's an ends and means approach. So with an ends approach, you want to have a verb, a problem, and a target population. You want to keep it focused on kind of the end of your, or the end that you have in mind for your organization's purpose. So just an example, the Monterey Bay Aquarium, its end is to inspire conservation of the oceans, and that's its mission. The mission for Livestrong is to inspire and empower people affected by cancer. Now you can also, and what I've also seen commonly is an ends and means approach, where you've got both, as an example, to find a cure for diabetes and its complications. That's the end that the organization has in mind, through the supportive research. That's the full mission for the JDRF. And for the American Red Cross prevents and alleviates human suffering in the face of emergencies. That's the end, by mobilizing the power of volunteers and the generosity of donors. That's the means. So an ends approach can be very simple, straightforward. An ends and means approach can also be good. Try not to keep it certainly not more than 20 words. Otherwise, it might be difficult to remember. And I've got some additional resources here on this page, sharing, the top nonprofits' mission statements, and just, kind of how to define a mission and vision statement as well. So next, we'll talk a little bit about why and how to develop a vision statement. Now, a vision statement is something that inspires, it gives direction to people's actions. It helps people stay motivated and engaged. And what you've got on the left-hand side is just an example of what a vision could achieve, where President Kennedy in the United States challenged the country to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade, and we did, which is just amazing. Now, how do you do it? One common way to develop a vision in your organization is to use what I call the newspaper article method, and there's a link to it here, but it's basically a process of asking yourself, okay, well, in 5 years or so, if a magazine or a newspaper were to write an article about our organization, what would it be like? What would they say? Which perspectives would they highlight, and what would those perspectives be from our different stakeholders, whether they were clients, board members, the community, etc. And and just as a word of caution, if the vision is very specific, try to keep it smart, and so that specific, measurable, actionable, realistic, and time-based. Achievable, realistic, and time-based. Sometimes I've seen organizations put up a goal that was such a big, hairy, and audacious goal that it did make one question whether or not it was achievable. So you want to have something that's a smart goal, that's achievable, that can motivate people, but isn't so far of a stretch that it's a drain on the organization. So just some things to think about when it comes to a vision statement. We'll ask again, the folks on this call, how inspiring is your organization's vision statement? And I'm going to ask Randy if you can put up a poll again for me. Thank you. Is it highly inspiring? Is it somewhat inspiring? Is it not inspiring? Or do we not have a vision statement? So it looks like some responses are coming in, which is great. We've got around 60% of people who have voted so far, and it looks like the majority say that our vision statement is somewhat inspiring. Some say highly inspiring, which is fantastic. Some say not inspiring, around 13%, and then around 21% say we do not have a vision statement. So something to think about, and maybe something to work on there. So next, we'll talk a little bit about a value statement and why to have values. So, values are really like the cornerstone of your culture. And what this slide I'm showing you has is both an empirical argument for developing your culture and anecdotal arguments for developing your culture, right? On the left-hand side, you can see the growth of $1,000 that were invested in the Fortune 100 best companies to work for index. So more of a for-profit example, but it shows you that the yellow line has outperformed a basic index of industrial companies almost 10-4 over about a 20-year time period. And that, some people say that that connects directly to culture. Now, a lot of other experts will also say that, you know, things like the stronger the culture, the less corporate process a company needs. Culture is the magic startup ingredient. You know, it's like the wind, it's invisible, but its effect can be seen and felt. And of course, Peter Drucker says culture eats strategy for breakfast. So it's one of the most important things you want to think about. Now, how to think about your values, right? What I like to do is describe values within a larger set of beliefs and practices that kind of relate to the cultural iceberg that you see on the left-hand side of this page. Now, at the very top, you've got cultural artifacts, and these are like the obvious things that you can see in an organization: the ping pong table, you see the library, the couches, the gifts if you use Slack, the emojis, etc. These are the cultural artifacts, right? Then on the other side, you've got basic assumptions. So these are the unspoken rules of conduct and behavior, like wearing shoes to work or shaking hands pre-COVID. And in between those things, you've got the cultural anchors, which are your espoused values. These are the guiding principles that articulate what your company stands for. And these can be kind of a focus in recruitment, rewards, and retention. Just some examples are, you know, things like teamwork, leadership, and humility. And there's a link for more examples as well. So those are kind of where espoused values fit into the overall picture. And as you develop your values, you know, through focus groups, interviews, and/or a values committee, you might want to have something like the following slide, where you have a core value, you've got comments from your staff members, your volunteers, etc. And this is some work that I'm doing with the client at the moment that's kind of under development. And you want to define your values and give example behaviors to make it very clear to everyone in the organization what these values actually mean in practice. And you want to make them sticky by having something like a values committee and conversations with your leadership so that they understand the values and that they're reinforcing them as well. So just a bit of a conversation around values. So that kind of touches on the purpose portion of today's talk. Want to take your questions, just kind of invite you to ask questions now about anything we've talked about so far, particularly around the purpose, so the mission, vision, values. Feel free to type those in the question box now, and we'll get to those questions at the end of the presentation, which is coming up. So advanced tools, right? What we'll talk about now is those advanced tools that I kind of touched on earlier, which, you know, are an option for organizations, particularly larger ones or ones that are going through changes. So from left to right, we've got a strategy map here, which is a visual representation of an organization's objectives and kind of how they relate to one another. It generally organizes objectives into 4 perspectives. These can be very powerful for an organization, and they give a team, you know, they give team members an understanding of how their roles contribute to top level goals. A strategy map can be really, really powerful, and I highly recommend it if your organization is ready for it, it's mature enough, it's large enough. It can be a very powerful tool. A balanced scorecard similarly is a measurement tool that links objectives, measures, and perspectives, and it's very closely linked to a strategy map. It was developed by the same people. It allows organizations to be focused on like what's called a balanced set of measures that link to their strategy. So not just financial performance, for example, but a number of other measures that I think would appeal quite a bit to a nonprofit audience. We've got a theory of change and program portfolio, and I'm sure people on this call have kind of explored what a theory of change is. You know, it's kind of like a pathway change diagram of outcomes, preconditions, and pathways. And a program portfolio assessment, you know, involves generally a needs assessment, a program assessment, and competitive analysis. You might want to evaluate your business model by looking at your revenues and expenses, evaluating your current program revenue expenses, articulating your business model and analyzing it. And then finally, You might want to do more of a more in-depth organizational capacity and leadership audit, where you evaluate all dimensions of organizational capacity, identify requirements for each category, determine how to carry out your assessment, and then kind of agree on priorities to include in your strategic plan. So a lot of different advanced tools that are out there for folks that may call out to you as things that you want to use in your own strategic planning process, but not absolutely necessary if you want to have a strategic planning process. So these can be quagmires that can take up a lot of time, or they can be very, very, very helpful tools. You just want to kind of think very strategically and very thoughtfully about how you want to use them and how you want to integrate them in your strategic planning process. So last poll I'll ask here is, which of these advanced tools would you like to learn more about? The strategy map, the balanced scorecard, the theory of change and program portfolio, the business model evaluation, or the organizational capacity and leadership audit. And it looks like around 40% of people have voted, and you're kind of thinking about it. But it looks like the vast majority of, and we've got one or more of the following. So strategy map leads the pack with around 50%. Organizational capacity is closely trailing it with around 40%. Business model evaluation and theory of change and program portfolio both have around 25%, and balanced scorecard has around 18%. So it looks like the strategy map is definitely the one that is kind of most in demand, and something to look into, and something also a good learning for me as well. So thank you for sharing your opinions there. So next, we will talk about kind of developing an issues or goals approach. And we had a question on this earlier. So, when will you use an issues-based approach, and when will you use a goals-based approach, right? So in an issues-based approach, what I recommend is, if you're in a particular VUCA environment, which maybe now, you've got serious internal issues to determine, or you're a young organization, an issues-based approach can go a long way in untangling some knots that are hindering your organization's growth. So an issues-based approach is a very valuable approach. Now, on the other hand, you can take a goals-based approach. Maybe if you have a more stable environment, or you have no kind of critical internal issues to address, like within the next year, 6 months, and perhaps you have the organizational maturity and readiness to kind of reach for the vision. So those are just some thoughts on whether you want to take an issues-based approach or a goals-based approach. But as you develop your goals or your issues, this chart can be helpful in kind of helping you think through, okay, so when you develop a goal, you want to have sub-objectives, you want to have tasks, you want to assign them responsibility, create a timeline, and then think about any resources that are necessary to achieve that goal. This can be a very powerful planning tool that gets everyone on the same page, whether you're a small nonprofit or a large nonprofit, and can highlight the strategic plan that you're developing. So a very good tool here. Next, I want to talk a little bit about socializing your strategic plan and drafting the document. Again, as I mentioned before, strategic planning is almost like going to a buffet where you can choose the different options that you want to consume, or that you want to taste. Here, the same is true for the document, where there's on one side of the spectrum a light model, and then there's an advanced, more advanced kind of document that you can have as well, depending on what your stakeholders want to see, what the people in your organization want to develop, what is necessary, right? On the light model, you basically want to have an executive summary. You want to have a purpose section touching on your mission, your vision, your values. You want to have high-level goals, action plans, and maybe a SWOT analysis in the appendix. On the advanced side, you could have something like a title page, a cover letter, an authorization page, a description of your nonprofit, description of how the plan was developed. You might have staffing plans, performance plans, financial plans, and references, to other related plans or documents, and then a number of appendices kind of touching on the tools that we have discussed in this webinar. So I want to just, again, take a moment to let you kind of reflect and enter any questions into the question box that we'll get to shortly. But yeah, just feel free to write any questions in the question box that come to mind. And finally, we have the strategy review, where you're reviewing your strategy on a quarterly, biannual, or an annual basis. Here, what you're asking yourself is, okay, well, why do you want to review your strategic plan on a regular basis? And that's a good question, right? It can increase staff engagement and follow through. You can detect successes and failures early on. You can integrate shifts in your environment. So especially now, you can see the value in having a regular review of your strategic plan. And it ingrains strategy throughout your organization. So those are sort of the reasons why you want to review your strategic plan regularly. And how you can do it, well, you can use a facilitator. You can focus on interim goals or measures. You can use a dashboard. You can begin planning for the 3-month review 1 month before the end of the quarter. So just kind of things to think about, right? And what I've also included in this section is a brief kind of touch on how to conduct your strategic planning virtually, because a lot of my clients are now doing their interim check-ins and their strategic planning processes virtually. And so some people are wondering, well, how do you do that? Well, there are some tools out there that I highly recommend using. Zoom is a good tool, for particularly its breakout rooms feature. Miro is a great tool for SWOT analyses. You can see here we've got a SWOT analysis that's just like it's like a whiteboard or a post-it note board that allows groups to brainstorm. And of course, Google Docs is a great way to work collaboratively and virtually. So it can be done, and it is being done. And so I highly recommend using these tools to develop your strategic plan virtually. And then, another really important topic that is coming up today is how to address social justice in your strategic planning. And Randy and I were talking about this before the meeting started, but there's many ways to do it. It's not necessarily a box you can check. And so what I've tried to do with this chart or with this illustration is just show you that social justice really needs to be integrated throughout your strategic planning process, not just, like it's not just one tool, it's not just one checklist. It's really something you need to think about throughout your situational analysis, your kickoff, your purpose, your issues and goals, your strategy review, and your document, right? So it touches all of those things. So that's really the strategic planning model. We've touched on all of those different aspects of the model. I want to thank everyone for your time, and also just let you know that in terms of connecting, you can reach me at my email address. It's nevin.kamath@gmail.com. You can give me a call at the number you see on the page. You can find me on Twitter, where I love to hang out, or Facebook, or you can join a Facebook group that I recently started called Simple Strategic Planning, where you can meet other people who are kind of going through the strategic planning process and learn from each other. So with that, I'm going to open it to Q&A and pass it over to Randy to kind of cycle through some of those questions and pass them over to me.
I've been trying to synthesize a little bit, but let's get started. I'm going to, first of all, there are a number of people that asked, remind us what VUCA is. VUCA.
Oh yeah, sure. Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. It was a term that was invented by the U.S. military in Afghanistan, and it's a term that's increasingly being used for the business environment today.
Cool. That was a number of things way up early on, and I thought we could address that quickly. So I sometimes struggle with this, or did until I started doing this more for a living. But the mission versus vision. Can you help just be a little bit more clear about the difference between what a mission accomplishes versus a vision?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. So the mission is really what you're doing, and the vision is where you're going. And the vision is like, what is the long-term goal of your organization, whether it's putting a man on the moon or it's, um, you know, changing society's view on whatever topic it is that you're focused on. And the mission is how you're going to get there. So it's kind of like the day-to-day activities that you're working on to get to reach the vision.
All right. Can you think of a few good examples of a vision that will inspire these folks to think about their vision?
Yeah, you know, the best way to think about the vision is, I think, in the document that I'm going to share, you'll see a number of vision statements that are like highly inspiring. And so I can't think of anyone like off the top of my head, but there's plenty of them out there, and I've got them in this document as well.
Awesome. Let's go into a little bit. This kind of falls in that mission vision. Should we review our mission and vision every time we strategic plan?
Yeah, good question. So I think it's definitely something you want to look at every time you do a planning exercise, not necessarily something you want to do on your quarterly or your biannual or your, you know, your annual basis. But every time you engage in a major strategic planning exercise, you do want to revisit your mission and vision. And even if it's just reaffirming what they are, that can have a powerful impact. That conversation can have a powerful impact on the people that it touches. So yes, I definitely recommend discussing your mission and vision, at the very least reaffirming it every single time you do strategic planning, because it's so integral to strategy.
Yeah, and I firmly believe, I'm going to just interject a little bit here every once in a while, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I firmly believe that your mission and vision is so much part of your DNA that there is not necessarily a review, so to speak, because you're living it every day. And if you're living it every day, it is more of a reaffirmation. And when you get to those major strategic planning moments, which, by the way, a strategic plan is not it is not a one-time activity and then we move on. It is an ongoing activity.
Yeah.
It doesn't sit on a shelf once we get it done every 3 years as required by your planning organization. Yeah, there are those points of review. Sorry, I'm editorializing. I'm not being a good host.
You're great. Don't worry.
I'm also going to editorialize this a little bit. Someone had mentioned that they're in a large organization and their large organization doesn't have a strategic plan. Should they build a plan for their team internally, and not wait for the larger organization?
Yeah, that's definitely something they can do. You want to try and tie it to your organization's mission and vision. And if it looks like there's not a lot of movement at the large organization level, having a strategic plan for your smaller team can be a very powerful exercise and something that you should definitely consider doing. Yes.
And I would agree. Make sure that I hope to goodness that your organization has a mission. Make sure it ties to that. But I call that, well, and I'm stealing this from Seth Godin, leading from where you are. You want to lead. People are looking for leaders in an organization, and you can be that leader to set your team up to be the shining example for the rest of the organization to go, oh, how are these guys doing this? And
Yeah.
so that's where I am with that. Some editorializing there. Um, uh, and you touched on this a little bit about someone had mentioned something about how do we consider our values with the whole Black Lives Matter movement.
Yes. A very good question, right? I'm not sure if I have the answer for that question, but those conversations are happening in your organization or around your organization, and integrating those conversations into a values discussion can be a very powerful exercise. So one client I'm working with at the moment is integrating that conversation into its value of diversity. Whether or not that's appropriate or whether or not it's enough is probably worth discussing itself, but it does provide a venue for discussing Black Lives Matter because it's a value that naturally touches on it.
Yeah, and I'm trying to figure this out too. But kind of my mantra is D&I must be part of our DNA. And how do we get to there? It takes several resources, and part of that is obviously in your values, but then like I'm trying to create a programming matrix where does it fit into is what we're planning right now, make sure that it is inclusive.
Yeah.
And it's every program goes through this scorecard, so to speak. So yeah, it is definitely part of the strategic plan, but it is part of the entire organization, and it's a big one that we'll all be kind of working toward, I'm sure.
Indeed.
Let's see. So let's. Here's a question. We'll see how this goes. It might answer some others that are out here. Should the vision drive the mission, which then drives the goals?
Should the vision drive the mission, which then drives the goals?
Yeah.
It's. I don't think there's a definite answer there as to whether the vision drives the mission or vice versa. The mission can be more powerful. It just kind of depends on the person and what inspires them in uniquely. The vision should be the long-term goal of the organization, and it should drive the goals, but I'm not necessarily so sure it should drive the mission.
Someone had mentioned that they have always been told that the vision should be almost nearly unattainable. Thoughts on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like reaching for the stars, right? Like it can be very inspiring to have a vision that's almost unattainable, that's not necessarily quantified, but like it's something that you're always going to be reaching for, and that can be very, very, very inspiring. I think the caution there is that if you quantify it and it is unattainable, then you've got an unattainable goal, and nobody likes those. So you just want to be careful to not necessarily do that. And I've seen that with clients before, where they said, okay, well, we want to reach this many thousand people by this date, and that can be, it can be inspiring, but it can also be overwhelming.
Yeah, it needs. I would venture to guess that you would want a vision that doesn't feel like people can't buy into it. People need to buy into your vision, and if it's so unachievable that people are like, this is poppycock, then it's like, that's not going to help you get volunteers probably.
Yeah.
Let's see. I feel like I've making up English. I feel like I've hit upon the general overall feeling of the one person. Maybe we'll end with this. Simple. How is this simple? I see a whole lot of moving parts here. If this is simple, what would complex look like?
I was afraid of that. I mean, it comes off simple to me, but I can understand that this is complex to folks, and so that's why I would, encourage you to join the Facebook group, where you can, make it less complex. maybe ignore some of the advanced tools, and just think of it like a cycle, you know, with like 7 steps. It shouldn't be too hard to figure out.
And part of my feeling on this is, you know, it is such a daunting task. It just feels heavy.
Yeah.
But there's steps, and just being able to, okay, let's conquer our mission statement today and make sure that does make sense. And now let's, you know, just go through the steps, and know that strategic planning is not an every 2-year thing. It is an absolute everyday thing. It's a, you know, it's a quarter. You have a heartbeat. A strategic plan has a heartbeat, and you just have to find that for your organization.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So thank you so much, Randy. This has been a really great experience for me. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak
so much for helping me to get on my soapbox a little bit here and there, but also to share this with people. It is, if you take it step by step, this is a really good process that has been laid out for you. So thank you everyone for joining us. We will be sending the recording. We will be sending the PowerPoint, so you can click on all those juicy links. And with that, go out and do good.
Thank you. Take care.